I'm not originally from New Orleans, and I am currently not living there now. I have recently moved to Florida, and I do plan to go back and continue doing tours, but I've been a tour guide in New Orleans for the past 8 years or so. So originally I'm from Los Angeles, California, and I moved to New Orleans about as soon as I could get there. Let's put it that way. And I don't come from a very academic background. In fact, I come from a very religiously conservative background where my parents sent me to college preparatory religiously conservative schools that did not prepare me for college. And I ended up dropping out of, flunking out of really junior college and making my way through finding friends who are in academia, learning how to read papers and do research and access libraries that way. Very much a self-taught scholar. But when I came to New Orleans and I started doing tour guide work, I found that perspective gave me a little bit of a heads up. It gave me a little bit of a leg up. And so I was doing the vampire tours for 8 years. I've done a couple of television shows. I've been on the local news a bunch. And I really like talking about this because I think that there's a lot hidden below the surface. When we talk about vampire stories specifically set in Louisiana, there are a lot of them. And the obvious ones, of course, are Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, or the television show True Blood, which was set in northern Louisiana. And I want to discuss and I want to address sort of the foundations of that. I want to speak to why so many vampire stories are set in New Orleans and Louisiana, and why this place is ultimately such a fertile ground for these stories. And I think that understanding the underpinnings is really important to understanding the true power and the true impact of these stories that we tell ourselves and each other. So while it would be tempting to lay the blame for every vampire story set in New Orleans in the modern era at the feet of Anne Rice and her infamous Vampire Chronicles, I believe that this is a short-sighted perspective that overlooks the many cultural, historical, and socioeconomic issues, past and present, which have made Louisiana in general and New Orleans in particular such a ripe setting for vampire narratives. Tennessee Williams once famously quipped, "America has 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Everywhere else is Cleveland." And apologies to Cleveland, but they know what they did. So it's little wonder that so many vampire stories are set in or touch on those 3 places. But for this presentation, I'm going to focus on New Orleans, the city, and Louisiana, the state in which New Orleans is situated, because few places in the United States feel so completely foreign, so completely alien to the American experience. New York has always been the penultimate American city, and San Francisco has its eternal place as home to the counterculture. And so each in their own way feels part of the essential American experience in a way that New Orleans, the city that care forgot, does not. If by exotic, we mean simply originating in or characteristic of a distant foreign country, New Orleans has always been different, set apart, and unique from other places in the history of the United States. Just as the vampire of the modern era has emerged as a creature set apart from and not existing in step with ordinary humans and their ordinary mortal lives. Both the vampire and New Orleans are anything but ordinary. The history of the eerie, the strange, and the occult and the supernatural, the macabre in Louisiana goes back further than recorded white man's history, though echoes of it remain in place names and the fragments of collected folklore which have survived through the ages. In the late 17th century, Jean-Baptiste Lemoyne de Bienville was surveying for a spot along the Mississippi River for a place to establish a permanent French settlement, and he finally decided upon a strategic elevated bend situated some 100 miles from the mouth of the river. It was as close to the delta as it was possible to put any settlement at all along the Mississippi River's twisting and meandering banks. To the Chitimacha, the Coshada, the Choctaw, and other indigenous people who made the land their home before the advent of colonization, this strategic spot Bienville had chosen for his city was a place that already had a name, and the name was Bulbancha. That is spelled Bulbancha for anybody who wants to know. Unfortunately, I don't have the I don't have the slide for that. But Bienville was warned not to build his settlement there. If the swamp doesn't get you, the monsters will. That is a thing that he was told. Bulbancha was an important trading post for numerous tribes, communities, and cultures up and down the river for many miles. It was a site of commerce and communication between far-flung peoples, but there were no permanent structures established at the place where New Orleans would one day rise. When the sun dipped low below the horizon, the trade would stop and everyone would disperse, sometimes dragging their canoes up a strip of semi-dry land known as the Esplanade Ridge today, until arriving at Bayou St. John, where they would paddle north to their permanent encampments on the other side of Lake Pontchartrain. They knew the dangers of the swamp at night. The quicksand, the flash floods, venomous snakes, poisonous plants that would cause welts and sores if one brushed against them unwittingly in the dark, alligators, and of course, other stranger things. There's a community a few hours drive west of New Orleans today. Once it was a few days' journey by river and swamp. That community is known as Carencro. The name is an Anglicization of Carrion Crow, which the French were told the place was called by the Atacapa people who live there. In their stories, they told of a massive beast that had gotten trapped in the swamp and died there, leaving behind an enormous carcass to rot for over a generation. Even in the early 1800s, there were reports by white men that the native women were using the massive bones of some unknown beast to pound reeds for making mats and clothing. And it was speculated over the ages that the enormous creature may have been a mastodon or woolly mammoth, but those creatures died out in North America thousands of years ago. A more likely explanation was put forward by local historian Jim Bradshaw in the 1970s, that perhaps a massive hurricane had somehow washed a poor lost whale miles inland through the bayous until it got trapped and unable to return to the ocean, and so it died. I understand that every so often these things happen in the Thames and in other river deltas. It's not that unusual, but there are kernels of truth to even the oldest stories. Stories of cannibalism in the swamps and fears of cannibal tribes of indigenous people were among the first fears recorded by the French settlers in the area. Now, Bienville was on really good terms with the Jena Band of the Choctaw Indians, the Choctaw tribe rather, and the Choctaw had a way of accusing some other indigenous people, particularly the Atacapa, of cannibalism. And I think it's important to take these stories with a bit of a grain of salt, however, since under the French interpretation of Catholic law in Louisiana, cannibalism was one of the few things that made enslavement of indigenous people absolutely 100% a-okay. If they're cannibals, you can make slaves of them. And so there's a history of accusing indigenous and tribal people of cannibalism in order to exploit their labor. But there might be more to the cannibalism angle as well. So the Europeans brought their monsters to the New World, and obviously of that there can be no mistake. When human beings cross continents and oceans, it's more than the clothes on our backs or the items that we carry in our hands that we bring with us. Our stories and our myths and our nightmares and our legends are taboos. They follow us wherever we go. And these stories become part of our identity, part of our legacy. And that legacy in turn is handed down over and over and over again across the generations until sometimes the truth of its origins are obscured and only fragments remain. New Orleans was established as a French colonial city in 1718. The word vampire had already been recorded in France for several decades at that point. 1693 is the first documentation that we have of the word vampire appearing in the French language in a publication called the Miqueur Galante. And while we have no surviving written account or oral history of vampire stories specifically told in New Orleans in the 18th and 19th centuries, we do have the rougarou. The rougarou is a corruption of the French loup-garou, traditionally understood as a werewolf story. But in many places, the French established a foothold in the New World. This folk legend would merge with existing indigenous and enslaved African mythology to create something new, something unique. To the Cree and the Métis people in French Canada, the rougarou is a Michif word for a shape-shifting cannibal, much like the Algonquin Wendigo. And to the Caribbean people in Haiti, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and Tobago today, the loup-garou is a type of vampire witch. Given the extent to which the Mississippi provided communication between peoples up and down its length, and given the extent to which the culture of the Caribbean shaped the city of New Orleans, is there any doubt that stories of the rougarou encompassed a variety of sins and taboos? I have my own story of the rougarou, and I will tell that a little bit later. The terrifying shape-shifting monster that lurks in the swamps and bayous outside New Orleans, transforming on the night of the full moon, seeking whom it may devour, sounds like the archetypical werewolf story on the surface, but as a cannibal story, it's also not far from being a vampire story. After all, what is a vampire but a cannibal on a juice diet? Following the Haitian Revolution of the early 19th century, Southeast Louisiana became a central growing region for commercial sugarcane being shipped to Europe. And within a few decades, white gold was creating the equivalent of billionaire sugar barons up and down the Mississippi River. If cotton was king in the American South, sugarcane was the grand empress. And the saying went that it took a wealthy cotton planter to make it as a poor sugar planter in New Orleans. The harvesting, planting, and processing of sugarcane was backbreaking manual labor, and to the enslaved population of the southern United States, there were few threats more heart-wrenching, more terrifying, and more awful than the prospect of being sold downriver to the Louisiana sugarcane fields, where few enslaved workers lived past the age of 25. So, when Karl Marx wrote in the middle of the 19th century that capital is dead labor, which vampire-like lives only by sucking living labor and lives the more labor it sucks, it is difficult to imagine a place where this was more brutally true than in Southeast Louisiana. The very first official vampire story actually set in Louisiana comes a bit later than one might expect. It was the 1943 film Son of Dracula, sequel to the 1931 movie. And the story took place in an old plantation home not far outside New Orleans. While the movie was filmed on a soundstage in Los Angeles, California, it would not be the last time that a vampire story set in New Orleans would be filmed somewhere other than New Orleans. I'm looking at you, the originals. I'd also like to point out that a kind of sharecropping that functioned as modern-day slavery existed in the rural communities upriver from New Orleans until the 1960s. 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, generations of Black workers tied to the land, hunted down and beaten or shot if they dared to try to leave, constantly in debt to the company store, thus securing their unpaid labor indefinitely, was something that continued to happen until living memory. It is a sordid, bloody, ghastly history of exploitation. But you tell me, what vampire story worth its fangs isn't also, in its own way, all of the above? Even if these issues are not explicitly expressed in vampire fiction, the brutality and injustice easily set the stage for stories of a predatory monster who look and sound and act just like us. That stage has been set. Interview with the Vampire is set in and around New Orleans in the years following the revolution in Saint-Dominique, which would become the nation of Haiti, the end of the War of 1812, which actually ended in January of 1815, the onset of American statehood, etc. Against this backdrop of massive wealth inequality, crushing poverty, strange illnesses caused by mosquitoes and polluted water, and lives deemed disposable and replaceable, why wouldn't the vampire find succor there? The TV show True Blood ran from 2008 to 2014. It's a much more modern story. It's contemporary. It's set in the northern part of Louisiana in a fictional town near Shreveport, the largest city in the region and the seat of Caddo Parish or county, where the oil and petrochemical processing industry is the largest employer in the region. In addition to this, Caddo Parish is the death row capital of the state of Louisiana, the state with the highest concentration of incarcerated persons per capita in the entire world. For a Black man born and raised in Louisiana, there is a greater than 1 in 3 chance that he will spend some portion of his life behind bars. In Caddo Parish, that figure is higher than 1 out of every 2. So when we talk about exploitation and that aspect, that element of vampire stories, I want to put this in a little bit more context. In the state of Louisiana, prison labor is used for just about anything you can imagine. Incarcerated persons are rented out by their prisons to work in the agricultural fields. They are leased out to work in the petrochemical industry to some extent. If you were to take a tour of the state capital of Louisiana in Baton Rouge, you would find that everyone working in the buildings, from those who are mowing the lawn, to those who are dusting the interiors, to those who are serving the governor and his family inside the governor's mansion, all of those are incarcerated individuals. And in fact, the state of Louisiana would not be able to run economically without the reduced labor costs that this allows for. A few months ago in New Orleans, the sanitation workers went on strike because they didn't feel that they were getting the safe treatment that they needed in the coronavirus outbreak. And so what happened was the state stepped in and provided incarcerated persons to work as unpaid sanitation labor in New Orleans until the strike was resolved. It still happens. So against the backdrop of the fictional outlandish happenings in Bon Temps, Louisiana, where sex and drugs and backwoods rock and roll vied for dominance against religiosity, extremism, and bigotry, real life drama played out every day in the impoverished communities of color across the region, where prison industrial complex, vampire-like, caused and continues to cause the disappearance of family members, loved ones, and community leaders. The grotesque situations, deeply flawed and eccentric personalities, decayed buildings and infrastructure, undercurrents of the supernatural, and sinister events relating to or stemming from poverty, alienation, crime, and violence, which are all hallmarks of the genre known as Southern Gothic, provide a popular setting for fiction, even as the real-world events that create these literary tropes continue. The descendants of the mortal contemporaries of the fictional Louis de Pontelac are still wealthy in Louisiana. Family narratives can whitewash a legacy that is often nothing short of vampiric. As poverty and processed food drive up diabetes rates across the state of Louisiana, and poorly regulated petrochemical plants pump carcinogenic toxins into the water and into the blood of the poorest and most vulnerable residents of the state to this day, the vampire increasingly becomes the most apropos boogeyman to wrestle with the real-life demons that wreak havoc and destruction. My favorite semi-historical story of vampires in Louisiana takes us back down to New Orleans, to the oldest building in the Mississippi River Valley, the old Ursula Convent. And yes, this image is from the Assassin's Creed game. It's the best one that I could find. But this is a fascinating structure. And that's a pretty accurate depiction of how the structure looked in the mid 1800s. So, constructed in the 1750s for the Ursuline order who arrived in the colony to provide education and medical care for its citizens, there's a strange urban legend about the unused attic, which occupies the entirety of the third floor of the Ursuline Convent. And I want to give you just a little bit of context here because this story is so bonkers. But New Orleans is established basically as a penal colony in 1718. No one in their right mind wanted to come to the swamp and build a city there. And so France sent its prisoners to Louisiana. We say that we were France's Australia for quite a while. But eventually fortune seekers started to come, and eventually people wanted to establish a higher standard of living there. And the birth rate was practically non-existent. The death rate was astronomically high. And it became quite obvious that there needed to be more women in the colony. So of course the Ursuline nuns were sent. And actually, as you might know, Ursuline nuns, or any sort of nun, don't really make babies. That's not the point of being a nun. But it turns out they were the only ones who wanted to come. They had actually been praying for the opportunity to come to Louisiana and minister to those lost souls in the New World. So they did their part. They tried. Within a few years of their arrival, they were able to sort of organize the transfer of female prisoners from France, mostly prostitutes and petty criminals. They were sent to New Orleans to marry the criminals and the miscreants and the ne'er-do-wells, and that didn't go over very well. I understand that the birth rate remained relatively flat, but the homicide rate apparently went through the roof, or at least that's the story that they say. And it became obvious that a different solution would be required. So they realized that France had an orphan problem. Like many places had orphan problems all throughout the countryside. There were young women from good families. Their families had died from plague or accident or some form of violence, and now they have no dowries. And these young girls were looking down the barrel of an ugly, uncertain future. And a dowry was provided to them on behalf of the Ursuline order, and some money provided from the French treasury. And they were provided with pots, pans, knives, needles, thread, anything that you would need as a bride in the colonial New World. And all these women had to do to claim these dowries was to cross the Atlantic Ocean on a one-way voyage, marry a settler sight unseen, and make babies with him in a swamp. And because desperate women had been making desperate decisions for a very long time, they boarded a ship in France and they began their journey to New Orleans. They carried their belongings with them in long rectangular boxes that were known as cassettes. And just as an aside, I found out recently that in Swedish, in Scandinavian languages, the style of long rectangular wooden box that immigrants often took to the New World, they called those coffin boxes. So there's some linguistic provenance to these boxes. Were rectangular and they looked vaguely casket shaped. They looked vaguely coffin-like. But this journey that these girls took across the Atlantic was fraught with peril. At one point, their ship was chased by pirates for 3 days. They had to stop in the Caribbean for supplies. People got sick. It was a very traumatic voyage. And we know details of this because there was a novice on board that ship who had not completely taken her vows. And so she had permission to write very personal letters back home to her family in France. And those letters ended up in the French National Archives, and they still exist to this day. And she described all of the hardship that they endured. Also, she mentioned that there was one of the sisters who had done something that caused problems. That one of the sisters had done something that people did not like, but she did not elaborate on this. And I think that's also part of where this vampire story begins to creep its tendrils in, because when this ship eventually does arrive in New Orleans, 5.5 months later, the journey's taken twice as long as it ought to have taken. there were far too many boxes on board that ship and not nearly enough brides to accompany them. And the young women who were there, they were gaunt and pale and gray in the face and bleeding at the gum line. They were quickly ushered out of public view so that they could, recover from scurvy and this horrible voyage before they could be married off to settlers in Louisiana. And then they started offloading the other items from the ship, all of these excess boxes. They were loaded onto carts belonging to the Ursula Convent, driven away from the river's edge, and then they disappeared into the walls of that structure, never to be seen again, officially. The records get sparse, they get spotty over time. What we do know is that around the time that this image that you see in front of you now was relevant. In the 1830s, the Archbishop of New Orleans kicked the Ursula nuns out of the convent because he wanted to take that structure and turn it into his own personal, private palatial residence. And so the brick building that you see to the left with the scaffolding on it, that was actually a later creation that is the St. Mary's Chapel that he had built adjacent to what would be his private residence, because he didn't want to walk 4 blocks down the street in the summer in his wool regalia to perform mass at the St. Louis Cathedral 2 times a day. So when he kicked the nuns out, there's a very thorough inventory that was taken of every item in every room inside the Ursuline convent. And they went up to the attic, to a part of the building that was only used for miscellaneous storage. And they opened up a strange room. And this room shows up in blueprints. It shows up in blueprints and building schematics from the 1700s. You can see that when the Ursuline convent was being constructed, there were provisions made for a brick room inside the attic of the Ursuline convent. It has brick walls, a brick ceiling, brick floor, 1 door into that completely enclosed brick space, no cross ventilation. But what these blueprints and schematics show is these long rectangular bed-shaped objects in this room, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, because with no cross ventilation, you're certainly not going to be keeping the living up there. But the story goes, what about the dead, or the undead, as the case may be? Because in the 1830s, when that room was opened, they found that there were not beds in that space, but boxes. They were long rectangular boxes that were not the long lost dowries of the girls who didn't make it across the ocean, because there was nothing in those boxes but dust and dirt. And there are pictures of those boxes that exist circulating on the internet today. It is a real thing that is really up there. But the room was, for the most part, sealed, and it doesn't get opened very often. And another thing that doesn't get open very often are the shutters on the 3rd floor attic of the Ursuline convent. They are sealed shut day and night, and you can find photos, you can find photographs that go back to the mid-19th century, and those shutters along the roofline of the Ursuline convent are always closed. And the strange urban legend that has emerged over the years in New Orleans is that those shutters, let's see, that's not a touchscreen. Those shutters are holding in a malevolent evil, that there were vampires brought to New Orleans from France to the New World to cleanse the city of her population of sinners. And then the Ursula nuns realized that they bit off more than they can chew, and they couldn't control these undead fiends, and so they locked them in the attic. There's a very growing in popularity young adult fiction series called The Casket Girls that takes this story and expands on it and runs with it. It is my favorite urban legend vampire story in New Orleans, because it is tied to the very beginnings of the city, and it does lay a foundation for all of these strange and creepy and supernatural and odd things that have happened here. New Orleans continues to be one of the missing persons capitals of the United States of America, and there are reasons for that. But I've always found that the story about this convent is almost more fascinating than the story of the convent itself. It speaks volumes about who we are and the stories that we tell and why we tell them. Just a second here. But again, back to the shutters of the Ursula Convent's attic. They're never open, not by day or night. And the last time that a shutter was seen open, it was immediately following Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And immediately after that, while the city was still under curfew, while the National Guard was still in the street, the Vatican flew somebody in to close the shutter on the Ursula Convent's attic. He was escorted into the building by members of the US Army National Guard. And I've actually had the opportunity to interview persons who were part of that unit who went in to the Ursula Convent days after Hurricane Katrina. There's no generator. There's no lights on anywhere in town. The sky was full of stars because the city was pitch black. And as they moved from room to room inside that empty building, in the shadows and in the darkness, this Army National Guardsman was specifically instructed by his commanding officer, don't look at anything and don't ask any questions. And if that's not creepy, I don't know what is. It was nailed shut with blessed nails. And it's not unusual for Catholic building materials to be blessed before they get incorporated into church structures. So is it overkill or is it just enough kill? That is the question that we have to keep asking ourselves. We tell stories for reasons. To eliminate our fears of events beyond our control, we tell stories of ourselves, of our shadows, and the other. We tell stories about monsters clad in human flesh who walk among us, because sometimes they do. And the closest we can come to the truth is to frame it in the fantasy of fiction. As for the convent's alleged vampires and the mystery of what the Catholic Church may be hiding, it would not be the first time that the Catholic Church has knowingly shielded predators. Vampires are us, Margot Adler says in her book of the same name. We are as guilt-ridden and conflicted over our poisoned relationship to the planet and our continued need for fossil fuels as any of the morally struggling and conflicted vampires we see on television or read about in novels are conflicted over their need for blood. And the vampiric has always had a home in the blood-drenched sugarcane economy of Louisiana. And that is what I want you to think about the next time you see a TV show or read a book and the vampire story is set in New Orleans or in Louisiana, because there is a reason, a number of very powerful reasons that these stories resonate so much in this space. And sometimes we become part of the stories ourselves. And so I mentioned earlier that I may have once seen the Rougarou. I'm going to tell the story again. I told it earlier this morning. And sometimes I don't like telling this story because it is sometimes a very silly story. But this is a true story. What I'm about to tell you is a true story. Every word I am about to say is true. It really happened to me. It was a full moon night in April 2010, and I was drinking in a bar in the French Quarter. It was like 2 a.m, and I realized that I was drunk. So being drunk, I decided to go home, and I just was going to get on my bicycle and ride my bike home to my apartment in the Bywater neighborhood, which is just downriver from the French Quarter. And as an interesting historical side note, the Bywater neighborhood was once the vast McCarty family plantations. And the McCarty family produced many prominent members of New Orleans society, lawyers, judges, politicians, and one Marie Delphine McCarty, who would later in life marry a doctor named Lalaurie and become Delphine Lalaurie. They owned a house in the French Quarter where they committed atrocities and medical experiments on their the enslaved persons that they kept in their home. So really sordid history of the McCarty plantation just to begin with. It's now a working class neighborhood of shotgun homes, and it's about a 2-mile bike ride outside and the French Quarter. And to get there, I had to ride along the Mississippi River levee. And so I was doing that 2 a.m, full moon night, riding my bike along the levee. And all of a sudden my peripheral vision picked up this movement out of the corner of my eye. So I turned and I looked, and there, silhouetted in the moonlight, was this thing on the levee. And it was a thing. It was bigger than any dog. And it moved with this strange, powerful, loping gait that I had never seen an animal move like that before in my life. And it has this almost stretched out, elongated neck and this squat humanoid face. And as I looked at it in horror, it looked at me, and then it gave chase. And for blocks, this thing got closer and closer and closer to me. The faster I rode my bike, the faster it came after me. And my brain was so traumatized by this that like I start having like gaps in my memory. I don't remember how I got turned onto the street that I actually lived on. But at one point later, I discovered that the skin was entirely scraped off my ankle, and I must have turned on my bike so sharply that I scraped my ankle skin off on the pavement. Like, that's how terrified I was. I didn't even notice that until later. And then my next big memory is I'm standing in my apartment, and the door is locked, and all 3 deadbolts are bolted behind me. And as the adrenaline is coursing through my veins, I decided that the best thing to do would be to go on Facebook and type in the words, "Oh my God, you guys, I think I just saw the rougarou on the levee," because that's what you do. And it was 2, 3 in, and now all of my friends who are bartenders are getting off work because it's shift change, and they decided to tease me because there was one very important, very specific, very teeny tiny detail of the rougarou story that is common in New Orleans, and it goes something like this. If you see the rougarou, you must not speak of the rougarou for a year and a day, because if you mention that you saw the rougarou, you will become the rougarou. So I was like, well, maybe I did not see the rougarou then, but I had no idea what I saw. So I tried to Google it, and I Wikipedia'd it, and I went on nationalgeographic.com, and I was terrified because I couldn't figure out what this thing I had seen was. Eventually, I got drawn down a rabbit hole of cryptozoology websites at like 4 a.m. These things happen when you're weird, I suppose. And I found myself on a website that had not been updated since like 2003. It had been built with Dreamweaver, and it was a collection of obscure folk stories from New Orleans. And one of those stories was of a creature that exactly matched the description of what I had seen. And it was known as the Beast of the McCarty River Road. And it had been seen in some form or another in the area going back to the 1880s. So for years, I had no answers. And for years, I actually had nightmares over this. I'm like, not even joking. I was very, very disturbed by what I had seen. My friends teased me every time there was a full moon. They made rougarou jokes. They made werewolf jokes. I'm like, I'm a vampire, damn it. But they didn't care about those details. No. And then in Mardi Gras 2014, somebody uploaded a bunch of pictures from the Barkus Parade. And the Barkus Parade is the best parade of the entire Mardi Gras season, because everybody brings their adorable dogs to the French Quarter and dresses them up in adorable dog costumes, and they parade through the streets of the French Quarter, and it is adorable. And I cannot stress enough how adorable the Barkus Parade is. But in these pictures that somebody had posted of the Barkus Parade, there was a knot dog. And this knot dog was all dressed up with like bells and ribbons, and it was bigger than any dog. And it had powerful hind legs, and you just know how this creature moves looking at its legs. And it's got a long neck and a squat face that wasn't very humanoid by light of day or, sober. But I did recognize this creature as both what I had seen on the levee and as an alpaca. And a little bit of digging would reveal that this particular alpaca's name was Houdini. And Houdini was a resident of the Bywater, and true to his name, Houdini had a knack, a talent for getting out of his pen and gambling about the levee on a full moon night. So there I was riding my bike home, and the alpaca decided to chase me. I don't know. Did he think that I was a lady alpaca? I mean, heaven forbid, that might have been awful. But as much as I like thinking that I was terrified by an alpaca, and I do tell myself that it was just an alpaca, there are not now, nor have there ever been, to my knowledge, herds of feral alpacas in the greater New Orleans area. So that still doesn't quite explain the beast of the McCarty River Road. And at the end of the day, at the end of the night, at the end of this story, at the end of this presentation being what it is, I cannot definitively tell you what I saw. I can tell you these facts, and you can come to your own conclusions. That story and stories like it are ultimately stories about us. The vampire and the witch and the werewolf are more intimately linked than a lot of modern folklore or modern vampire stories would have us believe. But I saw something that night, and it stuck with me, and it shaped me to this day. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was great.